My name is Father John Valadez. I'm the priest and pastor here at St. Timothy, Antiochian Church in Lompoc, California.
Father, who is Father Seraphim Rose, and why is he important to the Orthodox tradition?
Father Seraphim Rose is very dear to me and to many Americans and to people throughout the world. He was a convert to the Orthodox faith and grew up in Southern California. So his path to Orthodoxy is very similar, especially to people who are coming to Orthodoxy today. So he's a great trailblazer and pathfinder for many Americans who are lost and searching for spiritual life.
Talk to me a little bit about some of the writings that Father Seraphim Rose left behind, and why are they important for us today?
So Father Seraphim Rose undertook an endeavor in the 60s when he converted under the blessing of Archbishop John, St. John of San Francisco, to begin to translate works, spiritual works, particularly lives of saints, from Russian into English. And he started a publication called The Orthodox Word. And this publication he did with an extreme amount of ascetic labors. He wanted to use some primitive processes in being able to print. So he translated things from Russian into English that had never been translated into English before, lives of saints that had never seen America before, and spiritual writings from those saints, particularly the Optina elders and other ascetics in Russia. And he printed them on an old press, and he put together each stamp. I guess they were kind of like stamps, you would call them today, but he put every single letter together and arranged them on a page to be able to put them on. At first, the first press was one page at a time. So every page had to be put together with every single letter. Later, they would get a little more high-tech and have a 2-page one, and then ways to put full letters or sentences together. But he undertook this with extreme ascetic labor and a love to bring Orthodoxy to Americans. So things for the first time became published. And he left behind a great number of works, not only, like I said, from the translation of Lives of Saints, but St. John also blessed him to begin to write sermons for the bulletin, for the cathedral in English, for English speakers. So he put his pen to start to write some more homiletic type works during that time. And then later, as he became a monastic, of course he was a writer before, and he left behind, there's a portion of his work that is finished called Nihilism, which was a work that was supposed to be something that was in a greater context, the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man. But that entire work never got finished. He felt that he didn't have the spiritual ability at the time, and so in his humility, he kind of stopped writing that work. But later, after he became a monastic, he sought to tackle some issues that were happening in the church through the publication as well. So there was the controversy of the soul after death, for instance. This book, in its context, was written in a series of articles in the Orthodox Word, trying to tackle some issues that were happening at the time. We had a increase in technology in caring for hospital patients, for instance. So resuscitation became popular and more used, frequently used to save people from dying or bringing back people from the dead. And so people were having all of these experiences of heaven or hell or whatever. Some people, making a great profit by writing books about their so-called experiences during this time that was becoming very popular. And Orthodox Christians were asking, well, is this true? Does this really happen? And they were writing into magazines and stuff like that. And Father Seraphim saw that, they weren't getting a very good answer. Many times priests or other people responding would say, oh, well, we don't really know, it's a mystery. But Father Seraphim, being very versed in the Fathers and having a desire in becoming Orthodox to crucify his mind, because he's very brilliant. He really was a genius, I think, and he was so incredibly smart, and everything that he did, he went to its depth as deep as he can go. So when he became Orthodox, all the philosophy that he learned, everything had to be put in context of an Orthodox lens for him, So he didn't want any of his opinions to come through. He wanted to crucify his mind, adopt the Fathers, have his mind be resurrected by Christ, renewed by Christ. And so when he went to tackle these issues, he made sure that he was very familiar with what the Fathers were teaching. So he gave answers through that context, So the soul after death was one of them. Then you had some kind of bleeding in of the charismatic revival within the Roman Catholic Church, within the Orthodox Church as well, during the 70s. And so he also tackled that issue, the UFO issue that was becoming very popular and is now becoming popular again today, Hinduism and Eastern cults and things like that. And so all of those articles got put together in Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future. So those are kind of like the two, I guess, or the three very more famous books of his: Nihilism, Soul After Death, Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future, and then all of these articles that came out through the years that he worked on the Orthodox Word. Other works of his that were to be put together later would be God's Revelation to the Human Heart. That's something that a lot of priests actually recommend as one of the first writings or books they should read when becoming Orthodox. It was a talk that he gave at UC Santa Cruz, and from that talk, there's been bishops and monastics, abbots and nuns and presbyteras and stuff that have come from that talk. A lot of fruit came from that talk, and he talked about why one should study religion, pitfalls that happen, spiritual deception, things like that. Really, really great talk. And then there's other talks that have been recorded and have been transcribed and things like that over time. One of the really good ones at the tail end of his life is the Orthodox Worldview, where he talks about orthodoxy in the context of modern living. One of the large works of his is Genesis, Creation, Early Man, where he tackled the whole concept of evolution and how we deal with that according to the Fathers, and what does Genesis mean, and giving a great kind of compendium, I guess, of patristic writings on Genesis and what the Fathers are saying about each verse and things like that. And it's a great reference as well. So as you can see, he put his hand in so many different aspects, so many different areas, and he tackled all of this, in a monastery in Northern California with no electricity, no plumbing, working and toiling day and night by candlelight, and then, in the day, and a really incredible figure,
What were his views on evolution?
So it's interesting, when you say that, because this is something that he tried to get rid of, right? His own views. He didn't want to express his own views. And he said something very interesting when looking back on his conversion, where he said that he was searching for truth, his whole life, basically. And that whole process of him searching for truth from a young man up until, his death is very evident that he was searching for that with his whole being. And he said that he discovered truth as a person, and that's when he met Christ, right? So he wanted to give Christ to everyone. And so anything that he wrote or put together, he wanted to get to the bottom of the truth. And for him, the truth was conveyed through the Holy Fathers, which were inspired by divine revelation, by the Holy Spirit. So when he started to look into Genesis, and to put together all of these quotes from the fathers on Genesis, it was very evident to him that there was no room for evolution within it, no room for evolutionary theory. The big point being is that evolution necessitates death. Death has to reign in the world for evolution to be true. But we know that from the Holy Fathers and from the services of the church and so many other things within the life and context of the church, that death did not reign until Adam's fall. So Adam can't be a product of death, because that would necessitate a fall before Adam even existed, So there are some obvious things like that within it, but then he gets into more details in that book about the days of creation and shaping a really beautiful view of what the prelapsarian world was like, the world before the fall was like, and how drastically different it is to the world today,
I'm curious, what were his thoughts on UFOs, and how does that relate to, how can that help us in today's times?
Yeah, it's interesting because he really was a prophet in many aspects for people today. If you were to ask him that, probably back then, I didn't know him personally, but knowing people who knew him personally, he would definitely deny any of that, deny that he was any kind of prophet whatsoever. But his writings have proved true that he was, that he really saw where the spiritual trend was going and was able to articulate to people the dangers of where it was going. And so back then, in the 60s, 70s, you had an interest in UFO sightings and the increase of science fiction within cinema. And we're getting some of that today, right? Some of the talk of UFOs in the news and this and that and the sightings of UFOs. And he wanted to look at everything in an Orthodox worldview, to see everything from an Orthodox lens, from the lens of the Holy Fathers, that this whole concept of there's nothing new under the sun. And so everything that is going on today, an answer can be found in the Holy Fathers. So he found all of these incredible stories from lives of Russian saints that he was translating, that he was familiar with, and that related to UFO phenomenon. And so he went through studying UFO phenomenon and the different types of encounters that people have with these so-called alien beings and these ships that would come and things like that, and sightings, and what people felt during that time, what their experiences were with these beings. And he related them all to the ways in which demons appear and deceive people in the lives of the saints. There's one incredible story from the life of Saint Nilis of Russia, and I believe this was after Saint Nilis's death. There was a boy who lived in the wilderness with his family near the monastery, and the boy was outside playing, and a glowing being, came down from the sky and picked up the boy and vanished with him. So the father ran to the monastery to ask for the monks' prayers. They prayed before St. Nilis, and St. Nilis returned the boy to the monastery. So there's all these different things from the lives of the saints that he related to UFO phenomena. And it's important for today because one of the dangers that he saw, particularly with modern society and UFO phenomenon, was the fixation with it. So people can become distracted, fixated on it, and an entire cult can be formed around these beings, which we can see happening today, and it happened in the 70s, happened in the 60s. But he said this concept of an extraterrestrial being that is very, very advanced, which he made jokes about. They're being so advanced, yet they're crashing on Earth all the time. He said these beings that are so advanced, and the concept of them coming to Earth to bring some kind of world peace or to usher mankind into a new age of humanity and this kinds of things that was popular and still is popular in UFO-based science fiction movies and things like that, kind of painting these alien beings as saviors of mankind, of coming to be benevolent, to help mankind. He said we have to be very careful because this can set up the acceptance for the spirit of the Antichrist. That these demons that are appearing as these so-called enlightened or more advanced technological beings, now we're starting to think, or at least there's a creeping ideology that they're coming to bring us something good and to usher us into something good. And he even proposed perhaps these beings appear one day and say, look, this man here is the one who we have enlightened, that we have given powers to, that will usher you into this new age and give us who is a false prophet or an antichrist, So he said we just have to be very careful with these kinds of things and not to fall into these pits where we can be deceived by demons.
In his other work, The Soul After Death, what does he touch on in regards to like the toll houses or purgatory? I don't know if he mentions it in there. What light does he shed on those topics?
Yeah, I think that Father Seraphim's, at least, I don't know if it's so much anymore, but at least 10, 15, 20 years ago, one of the big, problems that some people had that were his detractors were his writings on the toll houses. And it's found in Soul After Death. It's actually a pretty small portion of Soul After Death, and Father Seraphim actually doesn't write much himself in it at all. He mostly just gives quotes from the Holy Fathers, and then helps kind of map and lay that out. He talks about also the differences in the experience of saints. Some saints have a very structured view of and experience with the toll houses. Some saints have a very unstructured one, right? And that he also gives examples of saints who didn't go through the toll houses. And he also talks about how these toll houses, we only talk about them as toll houses because it's a concept we can understand, but that they're figurative, yet at the same time literal things that happen after death. So he's very careful in unpacking all of that for us, which is great, and I think those that are detractors of his because of this writing should really go back and read the context of that he's putting it in and why he had to write what he wrote, right? Because like I said, there was all these false things that were happening to people, and they were writing books about and becoming famous about their experiences after death. And so he wanted to clarify, what does an Orthodox view have to do with this? What does Orthodoxy say about the soul after death? He does touch a little bit on purgatory, but mostly gives some writings from St. Mark of Ephesus it translates that for us on purgatory itself.
How has he personally affected your life?
He's one of my superheroes. I met Father Seraphim, not personally, but I was working at a tattoo shop, and the tattoo artist that is now a priest, Father Turbo, was reading his biography, and it was sitting. I don't know if I had gone to the church yet or not, if I started dabbling with Orthodoxy or not. I think I was reading about it, definitely. I knew about it from Father Turbo, who was working to become a catechumen at the time. And on the lobby shop table, he had just put it there when he was going to do a tattoo or something. And on the binding of it, I just looked and I saw this figure, this face of a man in all black with this huge dreaded beard. And it just really struck me. And I still remember it like it was yesterday, today, that it just drew me. Like he just drew me in. And then when I started reading Death to the World magazines from the 90s, the second issue is all about his life and what happened during his life. And being born in Southern California, in Orange County, he was born not far from where I was, in San Diego County. He went to college not very far from where I lived and grew up and went to college. So the closeness that he had in proximity to where I was, but also in spirit to what many people go through, was something that really spoke to me, and something that was easily translated, for me in first coming to the church. He was really the first saint that I got to know about, and then later St. John of San Francisco being like one of the second through him. But he was born into a white middle-class family with a Protestant background. His mother went to different Protestant churches. He had a brilliant mind from a young age. He wanted to be baptized. He wanted his own volition to be baptized as a young child. And then later, when he especially went to college, he started to see a drastic slipping away from the faith of his youth and a real questioning, grappling with God. He went through an intense period of atheism, and in that period he dove into Friedrich Nietzsche, and he learned German just to read it in its original language and to become very familiar with nihilistic philosophy and other philosophers of that time. He was really pulled into the over-scientism, the complete reliance on scientism that was very popular in the 50s. And so he felt that empirical evidence lacked for the existence of a God. He was also very angry with God, it seems like, from his essays that were written during that time. He thought that God, at least he was grappling with God as this abusive figure, that was allowing the world to suffer and these sorts of things. So he had a lot of really charged things to say about God during that time. But this intense struggle also tortured him. And he was an alcoholic. He would go into alcoholic fits of rage. His friends of that time, particularly one lady who was a Protestant named Allison that he kept in correspondence with for the rest of his life, talks about times in which he would be drunk and he would writhe on the floor screaming for God to leave him alone. There were times where he was with his friends, and he had one friend in particular that would kind of, I think it was a Roman Catholic guy, and he wanted to become a priest, but this guy would always kind of, flaunt his virtue around, and kind of say like, oh, I can't be with girls because I'm going to become a priest, these kinds of things. And Father Seraphim just thought this cheeky observance of who God is was so cheap and so plastic, and he would become upset with this man. And one time they were up on a mountain together, and this friend made one of these remarks, and Father Seraphim flew in a fit of rage, and he took his wine and he poured it over the guy's head and said, "Look, I'm St. John the Baptist," and started dancing around and yelling at the sky for God to leave him alone, and said, if you're real, then come down and strike me and send me to hell right now. He would yell at God this way. This is how he talked to him. And during that time of his search and that uneasiness and really extreme suffering he was going through spiritually, Alan Watts came to his school. And Alan Watts at that time was gathering disciples. It was before he was super popular. He would become a lot popular later, but this guy that kind of mingled American pop culture with Eastern cults and meditation and things like that. This really drew Father Seraphim in, and he became enamored with the whole concept of Eastern religions and Eastern meditation and the Eastern approach to a spiritual life. So he started to dive into those works. And when he graduated from Pomona College, he decided to go and enroll in Alan Watts' school in San Francisco. And this would become a period of his life of more agony and more extreme spiritual pain. Because what he found in Alan Watts' school was not only philosophy on Eastern meditation, but also a complete dive into the fleshly side of life. This school tried to balance on one hand the pious aspects of Eastern meditation, yet on the other hand, complete indulgence of the flesh. So Alan Watts gave talks on meditation, yet he would also have these huge parties and orgies and all kinds of things, right? So there was this complete juxtaposition that was going on. And Father Seraphim, for a while, indulged in this kind of life. And this is where we know that he practiced homosexuality, that he was drinking a lot, that he probably, who knows what other kind of substances he used during the time and what other things he did during the time. But this stuff tortured his soul. And there are letters that are preserved from his friends that he wrote in drunken fits and drunken rages, where he knew and he acknowledged all of the things that he was doing that were spiritually destroying him. And he began to see Alan Watts as a fake teacher because, like I said, he was always trying to get to the root, the foundation of the truth. And when he saw this guy that was teaching on one hand a selflessness, yet on the other hand driving these nice cars, dressing luxuriously and having women at his side all the time, he began to see that this is just another American facade for some kind of fake spirituality underneath it. And he met in Berkeley a teacher of Oriental studies, and this teacher was from China. He started to talk to him about more ancient forms of Chinese practice and Oriental practice. And so this is when he got into Taoism. And then he started to learn Chinese. Actually, he started to learn Chinese prior to even going to Alan Watts' school when he was at Pomona. But this is when he would dive deeper into learning Chinese himself so that he can read the writings in their original language. So he started to translate the Tao Te Ching into English and work on various other Oriental projects during that time. He ran into a philosopher, René Guénon, and this French philosopher really promoted an idea within Father Seraphim that I think led him to embrace Orthodoxy, and that was to flip this evolutionary worldview on its head. So the concept that we now as modern men are more enlightened than the primitive man before us. Guénon flipped that upside down in many respects, in saying that we have devolved from primitive man, and in order for us to get to a place of spiritual truth, the truth about ourselves and the world, etc., we have to look at the primitive man. So this concept of looking backwards to tradition as the fundamental truth rather than the obliteration of tradition and the acceptance of the new modern way of life as truth began to be more cemented in Father Seraphim. I think it was always there, it seems like, from when he was young, but this idea from the philosopher really was promoted, in his mind, I think. And he began to look and to dabble into almost everything. He called himself sort of a connoisseur of tradition, so he would kind of go anywhere. that tradition would take him, as this observer, a collector of all, being immersed in all traditions, he would say, but above all of them, So eventually he came to Orthodox Church one time, and he knew that he was home. Something in his soul spoke to him that this was different than anything else. He saw a very holy bishop serve. He saw a really solemn service, and he was struck in a way that he had never been struck before. He said he's been immersed in all of these different traditions, but something in this church was different than he'd ever experienced. But it would still take him about 2 years to become Orthodox after that. He didn't want to jump into anything without being fully committed to that thing, right? And it seems like maybe he had been burned so many times before, and burned with Alan Watts, that maybe he didn't want to jump into anything with his, with his whole being, unless he knew that it was true. So he began this search, and he, at that time in San Francisco, the churches that he was visiting were Russian churches. They were all in Slavonic. It was very, very hard to find anything in English at that time on Orthodoxy, if you can find anything at all. So he learned Slavonic, so he can understand what was going on in services, and he learned Russian so that he can read things and become acquainted with Orthodox spiritual life. And he stood kind of as a loner in the back of the church for a long time, until he eventually was I guess, introduced to his friend, which would become his spiritual struggler at the monastery, his co-spiritual struggler at the monastery, Gleb, which would later become Father Herman after they were both made monks. And Gleb was going around, he had been studying at Jordanville Monastery, and he was going around sort of giving a slideshow and presentation on Orthodoxy in America and the spiritual roots that many people had, Jordanville had, and other holy figures had, to monasteries like Optina Monastery and some of the famous Russian monasteries that were being destroyed by communism at the time, and were closed and or used as prison camps or whatever. And so I think that this was the final key for Father Seraphim, because it made him aware of the fact that Orthodoxy is for Americans as well, and that there are spiritual strugglers from an ancient tradition that have come here and now are giving out the Orthodox ethos to people here in America. So this is very important for him, coming from a mindset of Oriental tradition, and this idea of having a generational tradition that is passed down from a holy person to a holy person. That genuine link was very important to him. So hearing about these links and knowing that they were even within San Francisco, the same city he lived in, was something that was key for him. So he began to write to Gleb more and more, and Gleb asked for these young Russian people who were the same age as Father Seraphim to kind of like take him under their wing and to help him become assimilated to the church and things like that. So he was received into the church on the day of the prodigal son, and he said when he took communion for the first time, he had this indescribable taste in his mouth that stayed with him for a very long time. And he would ask people in enthusiasm, he never really told people about it. He wrote about it in his journal, but he would ask people with enthusiasm after they were received if they had experienced the same thing he did, But he had such a thirst for the depth of the spiritual life that being initiated into the church was not enough. That's not where he stopped. He continued to dive deep and dive deeper and dive deeper and dive deeper. And that whole period of his struggle to Orthodoxy is so similar to many people today and many Americans today who lose the faith of their mother and father or the faith of their grandparents because they felt that it failed them, that it didn't answer the questions that were happening today, that didn't have the spiritual depth that they're looking for, and to go through this whole battlefield of various traditions and supposed truths and being burned by them over and over again, being exhausted to the point where when they find Christ, there's this fire that's lit, inside of them. So he's this great pathfinder for that, and he's a beacon for everyone who is searching for truth today because, as he said, truth is a person, and if you're looking for truth, you'll find it only in Christ, and therefore it's only in his church because he put his church here on earth in order to show people who he is, right? So Father Seraphim got acquainted with St. John of San Francisco. St. John had an incredible missionary mindset. He didn't really speak English, but all the places that he lived in was a bishop in the world. He always looked for the local saints of that place. So when he was a bishop in France, he helped to reintroduce Western saints back into the Orthodox calendar. He would go through and he would research saints of all these different areas that he was the bishop of. He would put their lives together. He would bring them to the Holy Synod, and he would reinstitute them back into the church. So this mindset that he had was passed down to Father Seraphim. He had a great love for, at that time, was just Father Herman of Alaska. He wasn't canonized yet, but he knew of these missionaries. St. John knew of these missionaries. So Father Seraphim learned about Father Herman of Alaska, and they started a brotherhood named after Father Herman of Alaska that St. John blessed. And this is when they would start to translate and do all of their work on the Orthodox word under the Father Herman Brotherhood, later the St. Herman Brotherhood. And they opened a bookstore right next to the cathedral, and they had a lot of great conversations with spiritual seekers of the time. This is, 1960s San Francisco. And even Gleb, who would later become Father Herman, painted an icon, one of the first icons of St. Herman of Alaska. And St. John kept it at his altar in the orphanage. And when they opened the bookstore, St. John blessed them to process the icon from the orphanage to their new bookstore, through the streets of San Francisco, and what an incredible event that must have been to just witness and see. And so they had all these great conversations with people. But after St. John's death, even before St. John's death, they had a itch to go deeper. They were reading the lives of all of these Russian desert dwellers, these men who went out into the vast wilderness with nothing and met God. And that appealed to Father Seraphim. He was so adverse to modern culture because it had burned him so many times. And that's the interesting thing about his writings, is like, he's not just writing about Genesis and scientism because he was seeing it as from an outside perspective. No, like, it led him into his atheism. So he knew the dangers of it. So that's why he wrote about it, right? And he was into Eastern cults. That's why he wrote about them in Orthodoxy, or in the Religion of the Future. He was spiritually deceived. That's why he wrote about them, in these different books on spiritual deception and the dangers. And so he wanted to embrace this life that he was translating all of the time. And soon after St. John's death, they went on a search to try to find land somewhere in California to set up their print shop. And there's various miracles that happened during the time that allowed them to do it. But Father Seraphim in particular, not so much Gleb maybe at the time, but wanted a very, very remote place where they can struggle. So there's a story when they were looking for land of this real estate agent meeting them at some cabin in, I think it was in Northern California, And they went there, and the real estate agent, it was like a log cabin, very like pristine. It was a nice view. She had like just made lattes or coffee or something, so it like smelled like coffee in there. The fire was burning when they went inside, and she gave them this tour, and they're like, well, let's go talk about it together after outside. So Eugene was his name, Father Seraphim's name at the time. Eugene and Gleb went outside to talk about this place that they were touring, and Gleb was like so enthusiastic. Oh, this is fantastic! Like, this is pristine. It's like beautiful log cabin in the fire. Da, da, da. And Father Seraphim just said, "This place is horrible." He said, "This place is horrible," and Gleb was so let down. Like, why is this horrible? He said, "Why? What are we? We're leaving the world to what? Come to like a fancy log cabin and drink lattes? Like, no. Like, I want to struggle. I want to sweat. I want to bleed, for Christ." And so eventually they found this land outside of Platina, California, old, like abandoned mining town, basically, a very small population. And it had no well, no running water, had no electricity, nothing. It was like just a small shack. It was like a 4-post shack with a roof on it that hunters had used, That was it. And Father Seraphim was like, this is perfect. This is perfect. No telephone, nothing, wired up there. So they eventually were able to buy it through St. John's intercessions. They prayed at his tomb. They didn't have the money, and somebody from the church hired Father Seraphim at the Kleros to be a chanter. So they were able to pay for it. So what they did first was they just went up for like during the weekdays or the weekends, then they would come back for the weekdays, and they would switch. Gleb went up, and then Eugene went up, and this kind of a thing, until finally they can move their entire operation up there and take the press with them and all that kind of a thing. So they lived as lay people for a while in this wilderness, and to get water, they put buckets on their backs on sticks, and they walked down to the creek, and they filled stuff up, and they walked back. Later, Father Seraphim would like lay a tarp in the back of his pickup and go down there and like fill up his pickup with water and then bring it up. And they didn't have a way to get water. They lived on really, really meager, food, obviously, and their dwelling places were really primitive. They went down to abandoned like mine shacks and shelters, and was able to get all the wood. Now it's like fancy, like reclaimed wood, right? But they took all the reclaimed wood off of these shacks and built their own shacks with them that they lived in. And these shacks have like gaps, through everything. So I couldn't imagine what it was like in the wintertime. But this was where Father Seraphim soared, where he really soared. And later they would become monks there. The bishop would come up and tonsure them as monks, and then later being ordained priests there. And Father Seraphim also translated English services into English from Slavonic. So Platina at that time, what would become St. Herman's Monastery, was the one place you could hear the monastic services all in English. So midnight office and things like that weren't done in parishes, you could hear them in English going there. So that's something that people, I think, sometimes overlook with Father Seraphim as well. It wasn't just translating writings on saints for the first time, it's also services in the prayer life for the first time was translated by him. And so they would take turns doing services and printing books and that kind of a thing, and then more people started to hear about them. So people started to go up there. Father Seraphim was ordained a priest in the late 70s to help with all of these pilgrims that were coming up for confession and spiritual guidance. They started a St. Herman pilgrimage, they called it, where they would go up and Father Seraphim would give these lectures, these talks. Later, they started kind of a seminary academy where they went through dogmatics and things like that, and kind of like a seminary type of a way. That some bishops and priests today, they didn't go to seminary, but they have these certificates from Father Seraphim's classes, which is pretty interesting. But he really bled to give the truth out to people, and it's extremely important in getting to know Father Seraphim too, that one has to be really well-rounded and kind of looking at his life from all aspects. A lot of the time people are introduced through Orthodoxy and the religion of the future, or soul after death, or something like that. But it's really important also to read like God's revelation to the human heart. There's also a wonderful book, The Letters from Father Seraphim, that is all his pastoral letters, and things like that. And you get this more well-rounded view of who he was as a pastor and a priest, because those articles that he wrote were for a specific purpose, so his tone is very matter-of-fact, which is great. It's great to have, but we can't lose that other side of him that was pastoral and loving and really cared for souls, really wanted to teach people how to pray and how to be. He saw a really big problem with American converts either being overzealous or not zealous enough. And we experience the same thing today, maybe in a more magnified scale, but he told people that they should read things like David Copperfield before reading any Orthodox book. And people would be kind of like, well, it's not a saint, Charles Dickens is not Orthodox. Like, why would I read this book? But he said, people don't even know themselves. They don't even know how to be human anymore. They don't know what true feelings are or how to control their feelings. So how are they going to open a book on hesychism when they can't even get themselves dressed in the morning, And this is a problem that many priests are facing today with this flood of converts coming in, being raised and reared up in a really malnourished society, both morally and spiritually. Like, how are we going to give the depth of Orthodox spiritual life when like a person can't even get up before 8 o'clock in the morning and get themselves dressed and go to work, If a person's like going to work in their pajamas, and eating whatever they want all the time, like how are they going to fast, So he really saw that this malnourishment needed to be addressed, and so he would say things like this David Copperfield thing, and there were two lay people who were really zealous, and they now are bishops. But I've heard this story from them that they went up there and they told Father Seraphim they're gonna start their own hesychist monastery, and Father Seraphim just kind of gave them this look of disapproval, because it was just a joke, it's just a joke. Like when you're Orthodox for like a year or two or whatever, like how are you you're wow, like really a big ambition, so he would even admit, even in our monastery, he said in many of his talks, even in our monastery, there's hints of the world, and that we have to be aware of how far we are from the Holy Fathers. And we have to be aware of where we're starting our spiritual journey and really come face to face with ourselves first. And he was very big on people just being simple, that Americans need to accept that they're born into this malnourished society, that they have to understand who they are first before there's going to be any spiritual progress. That when they come into the church for 3 months, they shouldn't say, oh, well, my priest is not spiritual enough. I need to go find some guru somewhere else or something like that. He said, no, you need to buckle down. You need to submit yourself to the spiritual life of a priest that can guide you, and help you through this malnourishment period of your life before you can begin your progress in the church. So it's very down to earth, about the spiritual life. And that makes him also such a great saint for our times, a great saint that Americans can look to, that, I've traveled in Russia and Greece, and he's highly venerated there. Sometimes more venerated, especially in Russia. So he's looked at as a beacon across the world, venerated across the world, but he's really a saint for Americans. And we have saints, obviously, that were born in America. Saint Sebastian Dabovich, and then we just canonized Saint Olga, and there's some others that spent time here, of course. But Father Seraphim was really born into an American family as far as being relatable to modern Americans today, and so he really paves the way for us who are searching and in desperate need for Christ, because he went down to the depths of the hell of modern society and then shot way back up to the place that saints live at, So that spectrum of his experience makes him so incredibly, such an incredible treasure for us. There's in different places in the world, they have local saints they love and they adore. You go to Thessalonica, they love Saint Demetrios. If you're in the south part of Greece, they love Saint Nectarios. There's all these different places where different saints who have lived in those local areas are highly venerated, and they're seen as their beacons, their champions, because they came from our blood, they came from our place, they lived, they walked here, So this aspect of holiness is not something, 1700 years ago. Holiness is not something, in another part of the world. It's something that happened here in California, that this struggle happened here, that he passed by, the church that we're at right now, he passed by this place, several times. Same thing with St. John, passed by this place several times. So the fact that he walked on our soil, that he was born in our context, our modern context, and struggled through our modern context, makes him our champion. Makes him our champion.
You got me excited to learn more about his life and read more of his work.
Yeah. It's it's a bit disappointing that his life isn't in print right now. Because I think that it really should be, because it's such a valuable source and treasure to everyone.
It's like almost like $300, right? If like
it's ridiculous. But if anybody is looking for reading his life in that God's revelation to the human heart, the introduction is a small, very, very, shortened version of his life. His life, when God willing it's printed again, is thick. It's a thick one. It's exhaustive. It goes through his family background and his history and where his parents immigrated from and how they came to California and all that kind of stuff. And then all of his periods of life and St. John's life. And so it has a lot in it. And maybe for, there's a lot of people coming to the church that really have not learned the discipline of reading, right? So something like that maybe is a little bit daunting, but it's really a page turner as well. So
that's what I was going to ask you. Like, for someone that wants to learn more about Father Seraphim Rose, if they don't have access to that book, what can they do? What can they listen to?
God's revelation to the human heart, with that small introduction that talks about his life. You can get a good view of him by finding the Orthodox worldview. It's a talk. There's recordings of it. There's also, transcriptions of it and things like that. And being familiar with his writings is another aspect. I think particularly, the letters from Father Seraphim, if you can find the book, it's out of print now too, but sometimes you can pick it up for, less than $1 million online. That also is a great resource for just understanding him. There is 2 or 3 really good talks, if you can find in the archives of Ancient Faith Radio. There was a show by a dear friend of mine who passed away, called The Illumined Heart. And this was like when ancient faith and podcasting was like just coming up, you know. So Kevin Allen, he did this show called The Illumined Heart, and around the 25th anniversary of Father Seraphim Rose, of his repose, so he reposed in 1982, his 25th was 2007, so around that time, he did interviews with Hieromonk Damascene, who's now the abbot of St. Herman of Alaska Monastery, and the one who wrote the biography on Father Seraphim, compiled everything together. He did, I think, a 2-part interview with him on Father Seraphim's life. And then there is another one by now His Grace Bishop Gerasim of Fort Worth, Dallas and Fort Worth, who's in Texas. He was the abbot of St. Herman Monastery for a time, and he became a novice during Father Seraphim's lifetime, so he lived with Father Seraphim. And that's an excellent interview, especially as far as getting an understanding of Father Seraphim as a pastoral man, because he talks a little bit in that of like how Father Seraphim behaved during confession and church services, and his kind of daily things, his daily routine, and the humility that he had and things like that is really palpable in that talk. So if you can dig through the archives of ancient faith and find the Illumined Heart, and then find, you know, at that time it would have been Abbot Gerasim and then Hieromonk Damascene and their interviews on Father Seraphim in like around 2007, I think. Hopefully I'm not messing up that date, but it's around that time. If you find those are excellent. They're excellent to listen to. Well, I guess I should, you know, talk about a little bit about his repose. You know, he reposed very early in 1982, and as he was making his journey into the church, he almost died of this intestinal issue, and he wanted to enter into the church. So as he was feeling a little bit better from this, he went into a store, and on this pamphlet rack was an icon of the Mother of God. And I believe it was the icon of 3 hands, which is kept at the Serbian monastery on Athos. And he prayed and he asked her for time to enter into her son's church and to do his work. And soon after that prayer, he started to feel extremely better. And then he entered into the church, spent this whole life that we had talked about. And then at the end of the summer in 1982, he served his last feast of the Feast of Transfiguration was the last services that he served. And he gave an extremely beautiful homily under the stars in the mountains in Platina, telling, among other things, but at the end of the homily, telling the monks and the nuns and the pilgrims that we're just pilgrims on this world, and really emphasized we need to go to the stars. We need to go heavenward, you know. Soon after that, his pain became so unbearable. He had a pain in his abdomen that became so unbearable that he couldn't do services anymore. He was only taking a few visitors once in a while, and then kind of stopped seeing visitors because he wasn't able to answer questions. Father Herman, who was his co-struggler at the time, became very concerned, and they finally convinced him to go to the hospital. He didn't want to. He wanted to, this place that he had built and the spiritual life he had built, he didn't want to leave behind and become kind of like a captive in a hospital bed. He wanted to die there. So they took him to the hospital. They had found out that a portion of his intestines had died because of a blockage that had happened. The doctors were amazed that he wasn't writhing in pain weeks before he had come. That was like his constitution, what kind of man he was, you know. He relied completely on God. As they took him away from the monastery, all he was saying was, "Glory to God for all things," the same words that St. John Chrysostom said when he was exiled from Constantinople. So he was kind of strapped. Well, he was strapped to his hospital bed because of the pain. They did some surgeries and they didn't really work very well. Gangrene started to develop in his abdomen. He was in and out of being lucid for a little while, and then the people came to the hospital from all over the place and started to do vigils and pray, and his name went out everywhere for him to be prayed for. And Hieromonk Damascene, the abbot now, was made was baptized finally during this time, and Father Seraphim was supposed to be his godfather and things, and became his godfather and things like that. And so this is one of the last converts that Father Seraphim saw, and he really engaged with Father Damascene because Father Damascene had a similar bent toward the Oriental life, the mysticism and of Buddhism and things like that. And so Father Seraphim helped him out of all of that. But one of the last times that Father Herman came to give communion to Father Seraphim, Father Seraphim lifted himself out of the bed and venerated the gospel. And those that were onlookers at the time were so struck by this man who had crucified his entire life for this gospel, and even in the amount of pain that he was in, lifted himself voluntarily out of the bed to kiss the thing that gave him life, and these tears were going down his face. And one of those who was there at the time became a priest. He's a Rokor priest, and it became like the final, like, okay, this is the real deal. Orthodox is the real deal. But Father Seraphim ended up passing away in the hospital. During that time, he reposed, and they brought his body back to the monastery. And even though it was hot, sweltering, they laid him inside of the church, which obviously had no air conditioning and things like that. But his body remained supple. He had a smile on his face. He had a kind of his complexion wasn't great during his life because of some kidney issues and other things he suffered from. But his face, you see the photos from the funeral and stuff, it's almost like beeswax, like a glowing, radiant face he had. And people that stayed the whole night kind of over the body, they thought that he was just going to wake up. He just looked like he was sleeping, He was so peaceful with a smile and a radiant glow about him. And there was no rigor mortis that came upon his body at all. And they processed, after all the funeral services and the paniquitas, they processed, they buried him. They buried him on the spot that they served the first liturgy at the monastery. So when you see pictures of his grave and stuff, that's the first place that they decided to serve the liturgy. And so it's a really beautiful and special place for him to lay his for his bones to be laid. And soon after that, one of the bishops who was close to St. John, Bishop Nektari, was there for a memorial service and basically started to sing the glorification hymn for Father Seraphim, knowing who he was and knowing that he definitely, if any American can become a saint, that it was definitely this man,
How old was he when he reposed?
He was 50, in his early 50s, 52, I want to say, but I may be wrong about that. So his early 50s.
Wow, so he died pretty young.
He died pretty young, yeah. And many miracles, many miracles still happen at his grave. He appears to people. He appeared to people right after his death. And there's, just like at St. John's, there's a lampada with oil that burns, and the monks give that out. People are healed from the oil that comes from his grave. And so.
Have you ever had anything miraculous take place?
No, I don't think so. I mean, not miraculous in the sense of, I don't know, like, I guess, yes, miraculous in the sense that he definitely changed my life, right? Miraculous in the sense that this man who died before I was born became a great hero for me, and not a hero just in like, oh, this is a great figure in history, but a spiritual leader, for me, and really formed me even after his death, that I encountered him in some tattoo shop in Orange County, So a miracle in that sense, definitely.